Well, welcome everybody to the LTADchat. My name is Joe Eisman, and I'm going to be the moderator this morning, or I guess in the UK this afternoon. The topic today is bridging the gap between science and practice, which has been a long-standing theme in sports science and probably actually goes all the way back to the beginning of science itself. Certainly seems that there's people on both sides of the bridge. Sometimes they point fingers at each other in terms of who's getting it right. And then we also have people who are standing on the bridge, and of course, people who are at varying locations along the science and practice spectrum. It was this very topic, along with collision sports, that I kind of met the members of the panel who are going to be here today. For them, it was rugby. For me, it was American football. And at that time, I was at USA Football, and I met Professor Ben Jones from Leeds Beckett University, and then subsequently became more involved with this group, as now I serve as a visiting professor and doing some additional research and collaborative work with Professor Kevin Till, who's a member of the panel today. So Professors Jones and Till are going to be joined by Carlos Ramirez and Sean Scantlebury, both whom were former or current students in the program, and that's going to round out the panel today. If I actually go back to that time when I met up with Ben in about 2017, I had just finished a paper on translational sports science, and I was really becoming interested in educating and training scholar practitioners that were embedded in a sports science or sport strength and conditioning setting. So we started some conversations, and at about that time, the group had also published an article in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which I'll drop in the chat box, called Assessing Off-Field Brains in Sport, an Applied Research Model to Develop Practice. So we're going to use this paper and the group's ongoing work to serve really as the focus for today's discussion on bridging the gap between science and practice. And maybe before we get into the specifics, let's start with an overview of the group. How many staff are there? How many students? And kind of the general workings of the research group at at Leeds Beckett. And maybe without getting into the specifics of the practice research partnership. So Ben, you kind of want to start with like a really broad overview of, what the group entails and, how many staff, how many students and whatnot.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And hi, everyone. This is something that I find really interesting and really passionate about in terms of the whole research and practice continuum. So our group is made up of around 10 staff and 30 PhD students. I say around because it is an approximate. Some of those are purely embedded in the center of this research model. For example, they'll be funded by an organization and be doing the work through the university. Others will be university staff that are also supporting and part of this model. So it's a big, vibrant, active research group. But I think that as you described in terms of the continuum, the fact that there isn't a definitive number probably highlights how we've set it up.
Yeah, great, Ben. Thanks for that overview. Let's kind of get into the model a little bit now. Let's talk about, this practice research model that you have that was published in the papers. I'll put that slide up and maybe first explain, what you mean by working fast on-field brains, working slow off-field brains.
Shall I go again? Yeah. So I think that the whole working fast and working slow is the analogy that's being used multiple times in various contexts. And for us, it's around, in practice, you have split-second decisions, split-second time to make decisions, where in research, you have more time to review, think about things, critique, redevelop. And they can both be linked to the same problem. So if you have a challenge that actually you generally don't know the answer to, in practice, you still have to make a best guess decision at what's right. But in research, you can take the time to actually answer that. And, you know, one example would be, and it's a really simple one, is how long does it take players to recover? Are they ready to perform? And whatever context you're in, whether you're working with a 12-year-old amateur athlete, whether you're working with a 38-year-old seasoned pro, they both need to be recovered before an activity. So that example of, if you know the answer, you can make the decision quickly in practice. But if you didn't know the answer, then actually the off-field brains need to do things more slowly, more systematically, to actually find that answer to then help practice.
I'll probably just jump in there, Joe,
Yeah.
and add to Ben's Ben's comments there. Again, thanks for the invite to contribute to the discussions. I guess there's also, if we think of decision making, so actually, again, this poly decision making works on a bit of a continuum as well. So actually, coaches and practitioners can still work fast and slow. So those fast decisions would come sort of on the field in practice, where, like as Ben said, there's those split-second decisions to make. But actually, coaches can also work slow in relation to their, I guess, planning and reflecting, etc. And I guess then, like, research is probably an even slower part of that, in terms of that's going to hopefully inform both those decisions, those fast and slow decisions that coaches need to make. So I think it was some of the work by Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman, that sort of, you know, brought around this, and it has been discussed in sports science editorials by quite a few people. And I just think it's a nice way of thinking around things, and actually that research is a really slow element of it, getting that right. But coaches or practitioners can still work fast and slow, or make decisions that are fast and slow as well.
Anything to add to that, Carlos, Sean?
No, Ben and Kev covered it really well there. So I think happy to leave it at that.
Yeah, let's go into this model that I'm showing, and it's from the paper. So a lot going on there, and again on both sides of the bridge, if you will, with the practice side and the research side. So let's really dive into this model, kind of walk all the way through it, and maybe not only an overview of it, but the roles of each of these individuals in this process.
Sorry, I'll have a first go if that's okay. I think that when we did this model, it was a way of almost us conceptualizing what was actually going on day to day. And I think at times it felt like there were individuals with specific roles involved in this whole process who at times were unfairly judged because nobody actually knew what they were meant to be doing. And the example of that is if I just use the coach, and I agree with Kev that they do work fast and slow in their own landscape, but actually compared to a researcher, you know, if we're brutally honest, they wing it, because they have so many moving parts that they have to make decisions on, and how they train people, whether they recover, how they structure the session, that they make their, you know, they can't use all the available evidence because the evidence doesn't exist for what they specifically need to do. So it's almost showing that actually that person has a huge responsibility in almost working in that really fast landscape, but then almost feeding back to somebody else what they see as the challenges, because they actually see the challenges before anyone else does, because they are literally on the coalface. And then you have the other side of it, which is the statistician in this analogy, whereby somebody who is a fantastic domain expert with statistics takes some numbers, you know, can spend up to 12 months, sometimes longer, running this analysis, come up with a fantastic answer to a question that maybe is no longer relevant because the data's changed and everything's moved. And I suppose they were the extreme examples of the two worlds colliding, whereby, you know, somebody leaves with a problem they think exists, goes away, does it, comes back, and the whole world's changed for the fast person. And that's probably how we felt that this kind of middle bridging gap, that's their responsibility to serve that, because they can access the super slow, they can access the super quick, and they can also then almost manage and mitigate the challenges that come across that. So if there is a research problem that needs answering really quick, they can do it, and it probably doesn't need passing all the way to the right, which is a statistician. But there are times within all of our skill sets when things go past us, so that's when you'd kind of refer on. And I think for us it was it is genuinely the continuum of those people on the practice side are the people in our model that spend 100% of their time in the club, and they serve the roles and responsibilities of the club. The people on the right hand side, they spend, you know, their time, they're getting paid by the university, they are university staff. And the people in the middle, they're the people that can actually do a really good job at joining all this together.
Yeah, so let's maybe go to the people in the middle here, and obviously Carlos and Sean are probably closest to that, either being, you know, a PhD student or a postdoc and whatnot. So what kind of insight do you guys have with a foot on both sides, and how do you manage that communication and day-to-day activities between being in the club and being, you know, at the university or in the lab, so to speak?
Yeah, Joe, thanks for that. Thanks for having us. I do believe it's a real, one of the major strengths of the model is that by being embedded as practitioners in a real world environment, we're actually able to identify real world questions. So that will be probably from the research, leaning towards the research side of it. But at the same time, we identify some stuff that comes from the practitioner side of it, which will be probably the real world challenges. So sometimes if we are just in the lab doing research and stuff outside the real world, we might get trapped with some stuff, and we don't really see the real constraints that practitioners see. So I think by navigating both worlds, we're definitely able to ask the relevant questions and to try to find answers in a model, and considering the challenges that practitioners face in the day-to-day environment.
Yeah, Sean, can you give a real example of how you've worked in this capacity, you know, straddling the middle of this model?
Hi, Joe. Yeah, once again, thank you for the invite to speak on here, and hi, everyone. Yeah, I think going back to what Carlos said, being embedded within practice, it gives you a real understanding of the constraints that are in the environment, which if you say you go away and you want to apply research within the practice, whether that's actually feasible or not. So for example, a coach may want to understand how to increase the train load for a player specifically within that practice. But from a research perspective, you can go away, investigate that, but that's not really taking into consideration the other factors that are currently going on, which you might not be unaware of if you're not embedded within the practice. So for example, within the school setting, where I completed my PhD, the athletes would frequently participate within multiple sports or for multiple teams within the same sport. So if you just took that as, this is the school setting, I'm just going to investigate the school setting, you're probably not taking into consideration all the contextual factors that go around that. So for example, all the things that they're doing outside of school. So by being embedded within practice or embedded within the school, you're able to consider all the other factors with the athletes, because you know the athletes, you work with them on a day-to-day, which then helps you go ahead and formulate your research plan and your research methods to go ahead and answer a question, which you can probably answer a more specific question than if you just stood on the outside and sort of assumed what was currently going on in that environment rather than being embedded within it. Sorry, Joe, I think you muted there.
Yeah. Kev, I've been thinking, especially based on our last conversation in the LTAD chat that you did solo on Rampage. I mean, maybe for folks who aren't familiar with Rampage, just really quick, a little bit about what it is and how do you see Rampage fitting into this entire model to engage, both the practitioners, but also the research side of it as well?
Okay. Yeah, Joe. So I guess Rampage is a coaching session framework, an acronym that stands for Raise, Activate, Mobilize, Prepare, Activity, Games, and Evaluate. And it's, I guess, something that we've been developing over time to try and really provide coaches or practitioners with a bit more of a framework in relation to what they structure their coaching sessions that can be applied across multiple multiple groups, multiple ages, etc. In relation to this model and how we've implemented it, I think there is it does implement, but maybe not as well, because actually the Rampage is probably aimed at more environments that haven't got as much funding that could support this, and it's probably more of but it's an educational tool that is based on a lot of research that therefore community coaches or PE teachers can use within practice. So I'm not sure if there's I think there's slight differences in relation to this model, because a lot of this, the applied side of this, have been in independent schools or in professional clubs that have got funding to have that sort of middle gap, to bridge that gap. I think in terms of what we're trying to do in terms of bridging the gap through Rampage is provide better solutions to coaches through coach education, etc. If that makes sense.
It's in terms of building on this model, Joe, in terms like how it actually organically and genuinely started. Kev and I had edited a book called Science of Rugby, I think.
Science of Sport Rugby.
Science of Sport Rugby. And to be honest, we were from a rugby league background, both of us, in terms of our initial research, and Kev had done far more than I had at that time, and still has. And we were probably quite surprised how little research existed within youth rugby union, despite it being an absolute booming game in the UK. And at the same time, the academy that we were working with wanted more practitioners, and there were some real genuine tensions that existed in that organisation around really good questions that we just didn't know the answer for, and they were around which pathway, so whether that's the academy or the school, provides the hardest playing programs. What's the development trajectory of players? How much should they develop? What are the training practices and training load that athletes are doing? And then around fatigue and recovery, we have these complex training programs and playing programs that exist. How long does it take players to recover from a match, from training, from gym sessions? And they were all genuine questions that we were having with the academy director at the time, a guy called Andy Rock, who's now at Bath Rugby. And that's actually how it all started, because Kev and I initially, in this whole formation of it, our go-to space to answer this as academics was the literature, but the literature was empty because these studies hadn't been done. And that's then how we thought, well, actually to actually answer these questions, we need to do research, but we also need to serve the club's need. And the club needs someone in the gym on a Monday, and the club needs somebody to go and visit schools. So actually, if we can set these both up together, then actually this person can then start to actually answer the questions the club wants to know the answers to, which then fed across other clubs and into the RFU and the union. But actually the club doesn't lose out on the fact that they do need, the players do need someone to coach them. And that's probably how it started in terms of the genuine organic thing, as opposed to, it certainly wasn't Kev and I sat in a dark room coming up with a plan that then we put in place. It was very organic from us talking to a coach on what were their problems and then how do we build capacity and capability to help them with their day-to-day.
Yeah, just to jump in there, Joe, I guess, just to build on that, I think when we just build on what Ben said, and when we sort of launched the CAR project at the time, I guess the aims of the project were to, again, develop a research evidence base for adolescent rugby players at the time, and then really serve them from a practical perspective, from a S&C, sports science, nutrition. So they were really the two broad aims of the programme, probably specifically aimed at rugby union. And I think over time, I think those two aims are still our overarching aims, are to enhance the research evidence base and to enhance practice. But I just think over time that has therefore moved away a little bit from just adolescent rugby. And it's now it's sort of wider and probably tries to really just develop a research evidence base across a range of applied sports science sort of areas and coaching, and really therefore enhance practice for as many people as possible at various levels. So I guess Rampage sort of fits into that as one part of it, as a project where we've done some research and therefore have provided a solution. But again, there's multiple other solutions or applied practices that are being applied in different sports and different settings. Do you think that covers it, Ben? Sort of in a way how it's evolved over the last 5-6 years?
Yeah. And I think one thing that's we've not mentioned that's genuinely really important to us is how this model develops the practitioner as well. So the person in the middle, who's the PhD student, the research fellow, like we genuinely want them to have the opportunity to either step right or left. But actually, whichever way they choose, they then have a greater appreciation of the other side, which then in the future, hopefully, means that those questions are the whole continuums more joined up, because just people understand other people's perspectives a little bit more.
Yeah, you went right into the next question, Ben. I wanted to ask about this term research practitioner, because sometimes when I think about it, I think we all should be research practitioners and trained as research practitioners. We should have that training and we should have that mindset. Or do you think, and actually I'm going to throw this to Carlos and Sean as well, because again, they're kind of in the thick of being research practitioners. Or do you think it's okay to have people along the spectrum, along the research practice spectrum, as long as we can respect each other and work collaboratively? So maybe tackling that the first part of the question about, being trained and having a mindset. Don't you think how we should be training our students who are interested in this area, we should be training them as research practitioners?
Yeah, Joe, thank you. I think there's a whole spectrum. You think about a practitioner, and they will fit in different sides of that continuum that we have. That even with practitioners and researchers that are not necessarily in this model. So most practitioners will have a scientific background to some degree, and some researchers will have a practical background to some degree. But thinking about the model that we have, everyone has a place into it, and we do work in collaboration. So in the way that the research practitioner, which is a PhD student, is probably leading and managing into that specific research project that's being conducted. But at the same time, the head coach or some other staff from the club or the institution where we're involved to, they also contribute to the research, maybe not as heavily as a PhD student would do, but at the same time, they're an important part of all that engine. So yeah, I do believe everyone should be a bit of a research practitioner, obviously leaning towards their strengths and their position, and also the time and the resources that they have.
Yeah, I agree. I think from working in practice, there should be an evidence base behind the decisions that you make, but it may not be, as Ben said before, the evidence may not be there from the literature. An evidence base could be from evidence from a previous training program, something that has worked previously. And then going back to what Carlos was saying there, we do predominantly work within multidisciplinary teams. So it's drawing on information or drawing from ideas from, for example, from the physio or from other coaches, and using that information to inform your practice, as well as using the literature to back up any decisions or any training programs that you put forward.
Yeah, Kev, sometimes the both of us describe ourselves as pracademics, which is very much this research practitioner, and, you know, knowing, you know, your involvement on the pitch, but also as a researcher, like how do you view this question in terms of how we train, you know, future sports scientists as research practitioners?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking there while the others were answering the question that like definitely, I guess roles that I'm involved in now is across that research practice continuum, in that still, you know, on the ground coaching, not as much as what, you know, do as I used to. It's only a small amount, but still there, and obviously then managing and supervising students, and then obviously there's academic roles that we play. And I guess I think this is it's an area that both academia and practice need to probably improve and work towards, is really understanding those practical skills and what that entails, and actually, do we sometimes deliver the most appropriate degree programs, etc. I think that's what universities probably need to, you know, consider, and sometimes really understand what practice looks like. And I guess I think the reason that this probably model has been quite successful is, again, both myself and Ben have got experience and had a previous experience across all of the ranges. So we believe that academic skills, research, alongside those applied practical skills are important for everyone. But ultimately, people are time constrained, and I think and they have different roles and responsibilities that affect what they do, and that's where that contribution to the continuum is affected. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Ben.
No, I agree. I think the only thing that I when you talk about this, I get a little bit uncomfortable about sometimes, is when academics almost treat research as a protected title. And it's not every single person does research. Every S&C coach will do research when they deliver a program, see whether it worked, and try and manipulate something. It's the level of confidence that you need in you need as your outcome to how rigorous and robust your research needs to be. And I think that's, I suppose for me, that's a really important thing. But I think, you know, we try to set this model up, and it's and others are doing it in whether they've captured it like this or whether it's more organic, probably to, like Kev said, just to try and be a bit more efficient. And I suppose one of the bottom lines that we dealt with was that practice has data and universities have expertise, and they weren't sharing things. So actually, that, you know, from an efficiency point of view, it just didn't make sense to us, and that was probably why we tried to then almost like capture this.
Yeah, Ben, you've alluded to a few things here. I'm going to wrap into a question that Jason Avedigian has. So what you were just talking about there, like I often refer to as the living lab. Like practitioners, they operate in a living lab. They're capturing a lot of data on a day in, day out basis. And the other thing, earlier on, you had talked about how this model came about with, you know, there being little research in adolescent rugby. And I think that's where our conversation started when I was at USA Football, how there's very little research in youth and high school football. But the question that Jason brings up is, how would somebody who's interested in using this sort of a model or contributing to both sides of the model navigate an environment that doesn't have a working relationship? So how do you you know, if let's say you're on the research side, the academic side, and you're very interested to partner or work with a local club or school or whatever, you know, what are some key points that you all use when you go in and try to navigate a partnership?
Yeah. Do you want me to go? So as an academic, the most important thing is do not overpromise and underdeliver. Because we, as academics and researchers, we are absolutely driven by our enthusiasm, our inquisitive nature, and our passion for the area, which often can lead us to be overambitious. I think for me, one of the most important things from the research perspective is start small. And if you do something small and you turn it around relatively quickly, and when I'm saying relatively quickly, I'm talking months, not years, everybody understands that what it looks like, and then you can build. The examples of this where we've struggled, being honest, is when we've tried to do these type of studies on a big scale, and it involved lots of different stakeholders. And by the time we'd nailed down our actual research question, gone back to them, probably 80% of the stakeholders had changed. And they were like, who are you doing? What are you here for? We're actually going back to the, whether this fits with what Jason asked, but it was really picking off the low hanging fruit to take practice along the journey with us. And it was the question of, in our world when we did this, to the coach, do you know how far your players run when they play for the club or they play for the school? No. Do you know how long it takes them to recover from those scenarios? No. And they're the questions that they genuinely want the answers from. So in the BGSM paper, we talked a lot about the difference between an interesting research question and a useful research question, and being really mindful of, if you do it, what does practice get at the end of it that they can use? And that doesn't need to be a new gadget or gizmo. That can just be some new information that they can then place within their framework to help their decision making. So, all right, okay, I now know it takes 48 hours to recover from a match, but it takes longer to recover from something else. But it does really help. And that then is where you could then get to those real rich conversations that develop him.
Yeah, Carlos, Sean, anything to add there, being close to the practitioners, the coaches, in terms of, you know, navigating this environment if you're just starting to undertake this model?
I think one of the things that was really beneficial when we were developing a relationship with the school in Leeds Beckett was understanding what the coach wanted to know, and then how you could produce research to be beneficial for both parties. What questions do the coach want? What does the coach want answered? Is that possible? Because going back to what Ben says, it could be a question that is totally unfeasible. But if there are questions that can be done in a good enough time space, as Ben said, a couple of months, for example, how we can then make the partnership work for both parties, and what questions do they have that we could potentially help answer?
Anything else to add to that, guys?
I think they covered it very well. It goes back to the strengths of the model that we were saying, that by being there, you're able to navigate that real world environment and see what's needed. So probably keep your eyes open and listen to what's needed rather than what you would like to answer, because it might not be relevant in practice.
I think, Carlos, you have a really nice example from the Six Nations, which answers that. I think it'd be worth sharing.
Yeah. If we link it back to it by being embedded in practice, one of the things is we've identified that what practitioners want to know are simple things that are similar between different environments, and at the same time, they have similar constraints as well, people in different clubs, different organizations. So it goes back to listening to what they want and like understanding their concerns. So by doing this, we identified, for example, that common challenges in sports science literature, especially in elite sport or in elite youth sport, goes back to sample sizes. You have limited sample sizes, you have limited resources as well. So I designed, one of my research projects is looking at the fatigue and recovery during the Six Nations tournament, under 18 Six Nations, which is one of the highest level, if not the highest level, under 18 rugby tournament in Europe. So we managed to identify that it was a common trend that different nations were interested in looking at the question if the players had enough time to recover between matches. So as a general view, the tournament lasts for 10 days and players play 3 matches during the 10 days, which can be quite almost like a congested period of fixtures. We identified that different nations were wondering if they had enough time to recover. And by being able to communicate with them, actually reaching out to them and seeing what are their research needs, we managed to set up a co-petition relationship. We call it that way, so it's cooperation between competitors. So, and I think it's something that we wouldn't have been able to identify unless we were embedded in the field and actually seeing that there was a pattern and a common interest in identifying this. So by getting everyone to agree with a common research question, a common research concern, we were able to set up a testing battery during that tournament. We had 5 out of the 6 nations that compete in that tournament to agree in that, and everything was using real life monitoring to increase the ecological validity of the research that was done during a tournament. So we did counter movement jumps as for monitoring neuromuscular fatigue during the tournament. We assessed perceptions of well-being, and pretty much we looked at what happened with these players that are playing 3 matches in over 10 days, with the added benefit that we were able to have a sample size of 133 players instead of looking at a small group. So that obviously increases your statistical power, and it decreases or it helps you handle with inter-individual variability and stuff that happens during the match. So at the moment we're working in developing further this idea. So questions as practitioners want to ask are common. And if we are able to create this environment where we can help them answer them questions and we can help them provide the academic expertise, we can actually get competitors to share data through the university, through this research model. And at the end of the day, everyone benefits. It's a win-win situation.
Yeah, in terms of benefits, what's the best feedback that you've received from a coach, a coaching staff, or a group of athletes?
I guess it depends on the research question and what you're investigating. But an interesting story is that the Six Nations people who organized this tournament, they started being concerned about if this 10 days or 3 matches in 10 days, is it too much? And that probably was last year where they started asking that question or thinking about asking that question. And through the practitioners that have worked with us in this project, they went back to the Six Nations and they said that, well, they let them know that we were probably 1 step ahead of what they were trying to ask. So we already knew that, which is good because it went to practice. But on the flip side, and it's something to improve, I think, from our researcher practitioner point of view, if the Six Nations organization were asking that question and it's a question that was already answered, it's probably something for us to improve. but it was actually good to know that the question that we were asking was relevant for the governing bodies, not only for the individuals that we were working with.
Yeah, anybody else? Any feedback that really sticks out in your head that you received from a coach or an athlete?
I'll jump in there, Joe, with an example. So I guess so a recent PhD student of ours, Sarah Whitehead. So Sarah was the sports scientist at Leeds Rhinos with their academy throughout her PhD. So very much in that embedded role, and she was looking at sort of match play demands across the rugby league pathway in relation to the peak characteristics. So she did quite a bit of work in terms of understanding what those peak running demands were within, or peak running characteristics were within match play. And what she did, although it's not necessarily feedback, what she did for her final study in her PhD was to try and examine the impact of, I guess, her research and her role in terms of feeding that back to coaches was in relation to their training practices between 2017 and 2019. So she took a bit of a mixed methods type approach to the research and examined really the GPS training data between 2017 and 2019, which showed probably overall quite large differences with large increases in training intensity over that period, which again we don't know if that has improved the players, but has definitely showed that training in the club has changed over that time point. And then also Sarah did some interviews with the coaches in relation to how I guess her role and the research has influenced those changes, which from some qualitative findings did show some positives there, and actually, but also that Sarah's ability to feedback that data regularly and be an integral part of the coaching team was sort of massively beneficial in terms of the training process. So that's probably a bit more of a research study that we moved to try and evaluate the impact, which I think is something that we'll try and do a little bit more, and showed really beneficial results.
And I think a couple of examples for me, which are probably more broader, that for me make us feel comfortable that the models works well for all parties. One of them is that a number of practitioner staff have left and gone to other organisations, and they've reset up the model through Leeds Beckett to not lose that, even with one of them where it's a 4-hour location and there's a fantastic university close to them, but they just wanted to stay close to what had been set up. And another one, and then there's probably 2 other examples, which again are more about the staff rather than the environment. We've been really fortunate that a lot of our students, PhD students, when they finished in an organisation, a lot of the organisations want to keep them. So they don't just see them as a 3-year PhD student and when they're done, they're out. They'll look at them to renegotiate the contract and increase the funding. And that's how we're building the postdoc research fellows. And then also a number of students have been really successful at getting other jobs independently, but then have asked to bring it back into the university because they see the value of being supported, because it's not just about the organisation, the athlete, it's about the people that are all part of this. And everybody knows when they're on a gym floor on their own with nobody that speaks the same language as them, it's really difficult and it's quite lonely, and you don't know who to ask the dumb questions to. But actually, this creates a real community of practice that allows everybody to feed off each other.
Good. Those are great examples. Let's round out the episode today with really putting this back into perspective to get it to work really well. So the last 2 questions are going to be related to giving advice. So if we have to give advice for a researcher or a sports scientist who's interested in establishing this type of a partnership, what advice do we give? So one is for a researcher or sports scientist. The second one is for a coach. So we can go around the horn here and provide answers. If you want to just give advice for a researcher, a sports scientist, that's fine, or just for a coach, or for both. But how do we get this to work? What needs to fall in place for both sides? What's the key pieces of advice here?
If I go first, if that's okay, and then everyone else can jump in. I think I'm gonna go by answering Jason's question again, because I think that links back in. If somebody like Jason wants to do this, the most important thing is that the person that's trying to navigate both scenarios, you have to write two proposals. One that is coaching language, one that's academic language. And there's some real subtleties in that. The coaching languages use their buzzwords. Everyone has it, whether it's their what it takes to win, whether it's their whatever everybody calls it around their performance. Talking their performance language. When it's an academic, be sneaky with, sneaky is probably the wrong word, but around like how funding works. So for example, if you set up a 3-year project that costs £20,000 a year, you may say to the university, this project's fantastic. It will bring in £60,000, but it only costs us £20,000 a year. Like, you weigh that up, and actually you show the pros and the cons of both sides differently. So that's probably my broader one sat in the middle.
I'll probably just come at it from a, I guess, slightly different angle, Joe. As well, is that obviously the model that we've talked about today has been based around organisations, and we're very lucky that the university supported this, and professional sporting organisations have supported, but also that some people aren't going to be in that environment where that is possible. And I guess the other way that we've tried to sort of use a similar model is the idea of our professional doctorate program at Leeds Beckett. So it's slightly different from the model, but is really aimed at those practitioners that want to do research. And a professional doctorate, I guess, slightly different from a PhD, is that it allows it to focus primarily on their professional role and professional development in relation to that. So even if individuals haven't got organisations that can support this, they potentially they can still look for that personal development and professional development through our professional doctorate program. So that's, I guess, just a little plug for that program as well, which really ultimately is trying to still bring research and practice close together, based around problems in practice being solved by research.
Yeah, Kev, you hit on something I think for me is very important as well, because sometimes, we look at this model on the screen and there's a lot of people involved. And sometimes you go to, a local school and there's a coach who's, very excited to have a research practitioner join in and maybe help with S&C, but also provide a little bit of sports science support. And so you may have a very small team as well. So you have to end up doing this on a shoestring budget.
Yeah.
So I think that becomes important as well. And so I think some of your comments about, the environment are really spot on and are important to consider when people don't have all of the resources that your group does.
Yeah. And again, just building on that, Joe, we probably haven't really discussed it, and it's not represented in the model, but the model still allows opportunities for undergrads and master's students to get involved in that, and that there might be their placement and their dissertation linked to it. So there is still, those individuals, which comes back to your point around every being research practitioner, is we'll try and provide opportunities for as many, undergrad or master's students as possible, and then we encourage them to do their dissertation on related to their placement as well, which I think is important to consider.
Yeah, Carlos, Sean, what do you have to add to the conversation in terms of giving advice to either, other researchers, sports scientists, or coaches?
I think it sounds obvious, but results and implementation are really important as well, in terms of if you come for a question and it takes you 3 years to answer the question, and you're not actually integrating any of the results into practice, then the coaches and the athletes start to wonder, what's the point? Why am I answering 4 questions on a daily basis. Why am I taking part in this research when ultimately nothing is being fed back into practice? So I think one of the things that's really important to actually make the model work is answering questions, getting results, and then implementing those results into practice, because then everyone sort of understands why the whole process is taking place, and it is ultimately to try and develop the athlete.
Yeah, that gets back to working fast, working slow, doesn't it?
Yeah. What answers can we get and what can we implement?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just to build up on Sean's, I think we must remember as scientists or researchers that science is there to simplify processes, to make things easier, not to overcomplicate them. And I think it's something that the field of sports science specifically still has a lot of space to grow. So we tend to overcomplicate stuff, and that might be one of the reasons why our findings are not implemented into practice. Just the best advice I can give is try to make things simple.
Yeah, good. I want to thank the panel for sharing their time and their expertise on this topic of bridging the gap between research and practice, and again, sharing their model and their experiences in terms of how this can really work efficiently and effectively. This has been recorded and it's going to be available with all of the other LTAD chats on the YouTube channel. The next chat is going to be on Monday, June 1st, 4 p.m. Eastern. We're actually going to have a town hall around this idea of reopening youth sports post-COVID. It's going to be very specific to the United States. Obviously, this all takes on, national and policies and whatnot. So we're gonna focus it on the United States. Steve Boyle and Nate Babcock are going to lead that panel discussion. On June 3rd, we have Drs. Rodri Lloyd and John Oliver from Cardiff Met, and they're going to talk about their youth physical development model. And then on June 17th, Tony Marino is going to host a panel on weightlifting. So again, I want to thank each of you for being here today, and again, sharing how this model can really work and benefit both researchers and practitioners, and how we shouldn't stand across the bridge and point fingers at each other, but really work alongside each other and respect each side in terms of what they have to give, and also to benefit when this really works as efficiently as you guys have proved it can.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe.